Hello, and welcome to this extended Phylacter Friday conversation. I am Dr. Lisa Joy Burton, a finer candidate for International Phylacter of Zeta Phi Beta Sorority Incorporated. Today, on this Phylacter Friday, we're discussing a topic that often causes confusion in organizations: the difference between bylaws and SOPs, or standard operating procedures, and why understanding the difference matters. It's important to know when governance is unclear, trust erodes. When governance is understood, organizations operate with confidence. As we think about leadership, especially in roles responsible for safeguarding our processes, clarity around our governing documents is essential. So let's take some time to break down the difference between bylaws and SOPs carefully and practically. So, what are our bylaws? We all know that we have them. We have them on different levels. So basically, our bylaws are our foundational governing document of any organization. They provide structure. They give who is the authority. They talk about who can be members. They talk about how you can amend the bylaws. What are your meeting requirements? And they talk about all officer roles and duties. And this is just some of the information that should be in your bylaws. Basically, answering the question, how is this organization formally structured and governed? So, your bylaws should be adopted by your membership, no matter what level or of the organization it is, require a formal amendment process. They cannot be changed casually, and they serve as the highest internal authority. And depending on your organization, your constitutional documents are above your bylaws. And you usually follow your constitutional first and then your bylaws. This creates stability. So your bylaws should define your officer roles. And when they define those roles, the duties cannot simply be reassigned because it's convenient. And the same thing, if the bylaws specify election procedures, follow those procedures. And if you don't want to follow those procedures, then you must amend them. So your bylaws protect your fairness. They prevent leadership from being arbitrary, and they ensure continuity beyond any one administration. So when you're looking at your bylaws, you want to say, will this work 5 years from now? So make sure your bylaws are strong and they have standards that'll last past one administration. And in the office of Phylacter, understanding your bylaws is very critical because they determine your procedural authority, outline the jurisdiction, define what can and cannot be ruled upon. And without a firm grasp of your bylaws, it becomes difficult to protect process consistently. So some sample language, and depending on what your local chapter, state, or region governs themselves, you know the language that you need. So this is just an example. For Article 3, let's say it's officers. The president shall serve a term of 1 year. That is basic language. And then you would move on from there in defining what happens for each officer. Now, one thing about your bylaws, what you'll notice, they go by articles. And those articles, just as a standard, are written with Roman numerals. So we talked a little bit about your bylaws and kind of how you should put the information in there. Next, what are your standard operating procedures? So your bylaws define structure. Your SOPs define the execution. They should answer the question, how do we carry out what the bylaws establish? So it should have your committee workflows, your internal timeline, like exactly the time of the month that the chapter is going to meet. Reporting formats. So you might have templates in the reporting formats, what you want reports to look like, um, how exactly people are going to submit proposals. Those are things like reporting formats. Administrative process, your operational guidelines. So unlike bylaws, SOPs are a little bit more flexible. They can be revised less formally, and they adapt to the evolving operational needs. They provide clarity in daily function. So you're basically focusing on how things are getting done. And especially for your SOPs, they can be updated by the officers or committees as your process improves. So let's say in 2025, there was a certain process that worked. It is now 2026, and you're like, that's no longer working. So that is a time to improve your SOP based on what's working. So this helps ensure consistency and efficiency in all of your daily activities. So some sample language for your SOPs. Remember, it's a step-by-step process. So for example, here, step 1, submit the event proposal to the secretary. Step 2, get approval from the president. Step 3, announce to the members. So looking at our bylaws versus SOPs, just as kind of a review, the bylaws may state that a committee exists. The SOP explains how that committee submits the report. Bylaws can outline the election, but then your SOP will define or describe how the ballots will be distributed. So your SOPs enhance your efficiency. Your bylaws safeguard legitimacy. So both are necessary. If you have bylaws alone, you know the rules, but members might perform the task inconsistently. If you decide just to have SOPs, things are getting done, but there's no overarching structure or authority. Now, make sure we want to know what the distinction is between the SOPs and our bylaws, and that we can always understand the difference. And this is sometimes where the confusion lies. And this is what creates a challenge in governance. So there are 3 things or common issues that you may see with people dealing with SOPs and bylaws. One important thing to remember: SOPs cannot contradict your bylaws. If they do, bylaws prevail. So bylaws are at a higher hierarchy than SOPs. A second thing some people try to do: attempting to bypass bylaws through operational shortcuts. Operational efficiency should never compromise your constitutional structure. The Constitution goes over your bylaws. Bylaws are above SOPs. And a third thing, sometimes we over amend our bylaws to solve operational issues. Sometimes what appears to be a structural problem is actually an operational one, better addressed in SOPs. Helping us understand this distinction strengthens transparency, fairness, consistency, and then ultimately trust, especially for anyone serving in governance roles, especially those presiding over meetings or interpreting the rules. You must understand this distinction because this isn't optional, it is foundational. So leading with purpose means respecting hierarchy within our documents. Structure first, operations second, integrity throughout. And especially for our phylacters, the responsibility is not to create policy preference, but to uphold what has been formally adopted and ensure that operations align appropriately. So, a couple of tips for writing and maintaining your bylaws and SOPs. For your bylaws, keep the language clear and concise. Include only essential governance rules. Review them every 2 to 3 years or as legal requirements change. Now, you would usually set in your SOP or even in your bylaws when we are actually going to amend them and how we're going to amend them. And a good tip for your bylaws for the review, especially at the local level, in between administrations, it's good to look to see, is there anything in our bylaws that we may need to change? So it's a good time to review them and review them with your chapter. Even if you're not going to make any changes, make sure everybody understands the bylaws. For your SOPs, make the steps detailed and easy to follow. Include visual aids, templates, or examples. Update regularly as the process improves. One pro tip so that you do not contradict your bylaws is to always reference your bylaws when writing your SOP. That ensures alignment and that makes sure the SOP should implement what is in your bylaws. So make sure we understand the difference. That's the most important thing. And if you would like a SOP example, please send me an email at ljb4phylacter@gmail.com. So our bylaws establish structure and authority. They define roles, elections, and governance framework. You amend them through formal membership process. Your standard operating procedures, or SOPs, outline step-by-step process, explain how policies, and I'll mention policies in a moment, and bylaws are carried out operationally. They're more flexible and subject to administrative updates. Now, I know in some organizations, especially for Zeta, we have bylaws, we have SOPs, but we also have policies. Our policies set rules and standards that guide decision making. They're approved by authorized leadership bodies, and they also provide direction within the framework of the bylaws. So they don't contradict your bylaws, but they give better direction on how to carry out certain information. They can be usually just like 1 page long. So they're not too long. They become too long, then they're becoming basically SOPs. But if you look at the hierarchy, bylaws are over policies, policies are over SOPs. So our structure guides standards. Standards are going to guide our execution. So to reflect on our governance process, I want you to ask yourself 3 questions. Do you know where your bylaws end and your SOPs begin? Are operational adjustments being made within the bounds of governing structure? And are decisions grounded in adopted authority? Remember, clarity in governance is not about rigidity. It's about protection. It's about protection. You want to protect the process, you want to protect the membership voice, and you want to protect institutional or organizational integrity. As a leader, when you understand the difference between your bylaws and SOPs, that means you are better equipped to prepare thoroughly, rule fairly, and strengthen trust in outcomes. Your leaders should know what is in your bylaws. your leaders should know how to interpret their bylaws and be on the same page. So those are important things to look at when we are preparing to be leaders in our organization. Do we understand our SOPs? Do we understand the bylaws? And do we know the difference? So strong governance requires more than familiarity. It requires discernment. It allows us to lead with clarity. We can protect the structure and we can honor the process. So hopefully, by the end, if you reached here in the video, you can see a bit of a difference between bylaws and SOPs, and that you may need to go back and look at your governing documents and say, well, I put this information in my bylaws. Is it more operational? If it's more operational, it belongs in an SOP. And if you want help in making sure you have that distinction, I am available and I'll give you my information again at the end of this presentation. So I want to thank you for taking time to engage in this deeper governance conversation. And as always, I'm going to ask that you keep polishing your pearls by engaging in these conversations. These conversations mean you have a willingness to learn, to grow, to strengthen our governance so that he keeps us moving forward in excellence. So remember, order creates clarity, clarity creates confidence, and confidence creates leadership. I'll see you at our next session.